So for those of you who've not been in one of our events before, I'm Tony Hodgson, and I'm one of the founder trustees of the H3Uni enterprise, which is a not-for-profit educational experiment. And I've been pulling together some of the strands of mine own and colleagues over the years that we think might be useful for the situation that we now find ourselves in. I've called it the art of creative collaboration. The reason for that, I think, will become clear as we go along. But I'd like to start off with the proposition that we find a very useful summary of where we're at right now in the world. And the idea is that entering the Anthropocene, defined as the epoch where the scale of human interference in the planet and the biosphere is on a scale that is geological in its impact, is something that our consciousness is not ready for. And we can see that from the amazing range of partial but inadequate responses, as well as the huge amount of denial and looking the other way. So we see that as three tragedies. The tragedy of the commons, you'll probably mostly be familiar with from systems thinking and ecology. The idea that if there's a village green and everyone can put their cows on it, the more successful they are, the more they live around the village green, the more cows they put on it, and eventually destroy the resource that they're living off. The tragedy of the horizon is about the short-termism, some of which is a cultural conditioning, but some of it is perhaps our evolutionary heritage, that survival historically over thousands of years has been in getting through the day and not looking particularly far ahead. But that means that we neglect the commitment to try things and do things that are unusual and new, because we see the consequences of carrying on the way we are now. But we can't push that horizon out. And the tragedy of consciousness is, sadly, the lack of it, that we're generally sleepwalking into the other two tragedies. And somehow we seem to be locked into that. So here's one simple way of looking at it, that we're trapped in these tragedies because of certain conditions that affect our brains. It's clear, if you look at domestic and world affairs, that there are huge numbers of people with fixed beliefs that are not changing. There's huge ignorance as to what's really going on, including denial type of ignorance. There's distortion in that fake news has largely displaced anything we might call truth. And there's factional exploitation in that people with power and resources continue to extract and accumulate resources. So you get the growing divide between the 1% and the 99%. And there are all kinds of fantasies or ideologies around, whether it be about consumerism or the historical Russia, or the rising supremacy of the Chinese people, or the right of the Brits to own the planet, and so on. All of those kind of myths dominate. And so the idea that we can just simply have better collaboration, carrying on the way that we've got to here, doesn't seem very tenable. And one of the reasons for this, out of several, I've just picked one, is the fascinating work by Ian McGilchrist on the right and left hemispheres. I'm not talking about what used to be, the right brain, left brain stuff of old, which is largely inaccurate and is considered so by McGilchrist, but the more recent comprehensive research that brings together a great amount of psychology and neurobiology and psychiatry and so on. And it does seem that the short-termism and inability to see the system dynamics of the commons is a natural function of the left brain. It's not surprising if the left brain is dominant, whereas the right hemisphere is our inherent capacity to have vision, to see the bigger picture, to think holistically, to be more inclusive, more empathetic, and so on. And it's interesting that McGilchrist's previous book, before his mighty two-volume tome that's recently came out, which I can hardly lift off the desk, it's got about 5,000 citations in it, that was summed up as in the title of his book, The Master and His Emissary. And his case was that the way we seem to be structured is that the right hemisphere should be the master, which incidentally connects much more empathetically with the emotional intelligence and the spiritual intelligence. And the left brain should be the servant. And we've got the servant running the master in our culture. So if we're going to have any effect on getting out of the Anthropocene traps, we need approaches which involve the whole person as far as possible. So I've been particularly concerned in my research over the years in study, in practice, in more academic type research, and in innovation, to understand the role of learning, particularly deep learning, meaning not learning of information, but learning of, for example, different ways of seeing, different ways of understanding, and so on. And I'd like to sum that up by quoting a client of mine from, must be heavens, about 40 years ago now, who had a big impact on my thinking. He was a senior executive in a large corporation. And to the conventional view, paradoxically, he was very interested in learning. And he said what obsessed him was something like this, I'm just paraphrasing. Why, when a group of intelligent people come together to share a task, do they so frequently amount to one idiot? Let's think about it. I'm taking a number of smiles and grins around the screen to indicate you get it. You've been there, you experience it. Okay. So there's something else weird going on, as well as this sort of state of our brain, if we use that as a kind of shorthand. So I've pulled together and distilled from countless threads a picture of what I consider an effective state of the human being is to be very conducive to creative collaboration. I'm not putting it forward as the answer. I'm simply offering it as 40 or 50 years of investigation in myself and in others and situations of this predicament. And in the spirit of learning, it is extremely unfinished business. But having said that, we're also living in the now. We need to be able to improve our way of being in the world right from this very moment. So in the tradition of visual thinking, or I'm very interested also in the more Eastern versions of using mandalas to concentrate knowledge. I've got a little mandala here that I've been using and proposing 8 capability areas. Now, those of you who are familiar with H3Uni's methods like 3 horizons or the world model or navigating dilemmas and so on, I'm not talking about that kind of capability, about what we might call the tools of the trade. I'm talking about the condition and state and capability of the craftsperson using the tools. So there are some headings here which simply act as a kind of way of gathering a segment together. If you look through them and you consider that they've all got skills and techniques and other aids, as it were, connected with them, it's pretty complex. But actually, at the heart of them is our human experience. So I think it's useful to realize that although you could say that my speciality has been included, not entirely exclusively, but included what you might call the profession of facilitator, that actually this is about being human, that creative collaboration really is helped the more human we are. And there are many factors in society that hide that humanity and bury it and distort it. So let's look at this in a very simple way. So I put an outer circle around this, which is just some thoughts about everyday experience that will connect with this this view. Let's start with self-awareness. That's a lifetime's experience in itself, but we can start from the fact that we all recognize that we have moments of reflection, somehow of sitting back, of experiencing a stronger, as it were, observation of ourselves, an ability perhaps to, for a moment at least, to pass impartial judgment on our own nature and behavior. And that's one of the things which creative collaboration needs, that it needs that capacity of any individual in the process of collaborating to be able to more impartially review their own behavior and performance. Clearly, if we're going to have collaboration, then if people have no feeling for the other, that somehow people are objects to be controlled and engineered, then that may be effective for getting certain things done, but it's certainly not very effective for evoking shared creativity. I had a strong experience of that. I think I was probably about 22 years old the first time I went to New York, and I was probably in a taxi from the airport to the city, and I noticed that the cabbie had a little card stuck on his dashboard which simply said, "Let me not criticize any man until I've walked a mile in his moccasins." And obviously it had some guy with feathers on his head next to the words. Very simple, but at that moment in my life, that was a very kind of jolt. It really struck me. So without feeling for the other, it's hard to actually be a catalyst for creative collaboration. Obviously, creation, although it has that quality very often of what you might call spontaneous eruption, it just pops out, the famous light bulb experience, that's usually taken on its own, a deception, that actually creativity is an ongoing process that goes through stages and phases. And a bit like a river in porous geology, it runs above ground and underground, and that keeps changing. So having a sense of the process of what are we going through here? Now, the visual artist, say, painting a picture, or the musician composing a piece of music, has a sense of process. They may not have a kind of codified discipline, or they might indeed be very disciplined indeed in the way that they paint pictures or write novels. But when we look at world problems and the way politicians work and the way policy people work and the way people operate in local authorities and companies and all that, often process awareness is quite limited. Fortunately, I had as a client for a while one company that was very competent at that level, and they were relatively a joy to work with. Another area that we all experience, of course, is, we have a good conversation. We've got together with somebody or a small group that we get on with, and we're trying to sort something out, and there's a really good flow going, and in a more developed way, that's obviously the basis of dialogue methods. So if we're not kind of having that kind of interactive skill, then that's not going to be particularly helpful for creative collaboration. And then there's a question of, well, what is the kind of task that we're engaging in? Now, I mentioned a few arts analogies because we more usually associate that with creativity. But actually, if we're trying to design something, or we're trying to solve a difficult, even technological problem, or we're trying to resolve some kind of political impasse, it helps to have a method or two that actually match the condition we're trying to deal with. So, for example, in the H3Uni experiment, you'll find on our website 5 key methods that we've singled out. Actually, we've got a library building up of about, I don't know, anything from 20 to 50, depending on how you cut it, but it's going to take us a while to actually pull those through into visibility. So if you're in a very tense standoff situation, but there's some hope of dialogue, then having the method of dilemma resolution, for example, gives you a way of actually structuring a process and a conversation and developing mutual feelings and so on, and creating a reflective space to actually progress that kind of difficulty. Whereas without it, you tend to get projection of assumptions and conflict, and it just goes around in circles. We're having quite a lot of that in the UK at the moment with the cost of living crisis. It's very interesting to see how the absence of any skill at dilemma resolution is tubing the economy, frankly. And then there's something about pattern recognition. We all have some sense of beauty or form or elegance or economy, in the sense of the quality of doing things with the minimum effort for the maximum effect. And we've drawn a lot on pattern thinking, and some of that stems from way back in the origins of systems science of Gregory Bateson's statement about understanding the pattern that connects. And so one of the things you'll find we're working on in H3Uni is something we call pattern dynamics. And then there's also something in conventionally we perhaps call it getting to the point, or cut to the chase, or what's this really about? But intuitively, that's something that we all have a capacity for, which is, in certain circumstances, we just kind of tune in to the heart of it, and it's not against rationality, but it isn't arrived at through a rational process. But can we cultivate that? Can we turn it into a skill? And then we've got the final one here, which is around the area of mental repatterning. How do we actually change our mind? If you look at human behavior around the planet, there's quite a lot of fixation, ideology, belief systems, and those tend to form into tribes and cults, even the cult of consumerism, although they don't call it a cult. And then that becomes set against other belief systems, and you've got religious wars, you've got political wars, you've got domestic wars, and so on and so on. So part of learning is how can we actually help ourselves and others to change our minds in a positive way. Obviously, we don't want to go the opposite extreme and can't make our minds up about anything and we're vacillating. Actually, that's a subconscious fixation as well. It's just more buried. So one of the key word pair that we've come up with in our research is participative repatterning. That is the idea that everyone needs to join in. In other words, it's not like what I'm doing now. This is not participative repatterning. I'm giving a lecture. It's different. But the repatterning is we're sharing our joint change of mind so that hopefully we arrive at a different map of the world that none of us have seen before, which is co-created out of the contributions and interactions that have been going on. Okay, so let's just whirl through these at the more sort of technical level. And this is a whirlwind, because the whole idea of designing a course to run next year is to actually give each of these 8 zones a whole hour and a half to itself, to actually go into it more thoroughly. So cognitive framing and reframing is really, what is our mental tool set? And coupled with that, something that's often overlooked is that often groups meet together to share a task when they haven't actually stood back and got clarity about what the task really is. And so people aren't even setting off on the same page. And so the idea of having a set of tools for that, which is part of our resource library idea, comes into that. But there are all kinds of other things besides that. But the important thing is that the tools actually match the nature of ambiguity and uncertainty and open challenge that a creative task requires. Interactive skill. Well, the obvious thing here is, of course, around the theme of inclusion and all voices shall be heard, and recognizing that part of creative collaboration is the, you might almost call it a faith that everyone involved has something to contribute. It may be the weakest voice that has got the most critical factor in their mind to actually share in the group. So if you have a sort of voices being drowned out in a task group, then that's not going to develop the interactive skill that's needed. Then there's the mysterious area of group dynamics. I learnt in my 20s and 30s and partly studied the work of the Tavistock Institute in London on the nature of group behavior, and the idea of task groups have us generate their own group subconscious, which tends to have quite different purposes from the ostensible task. So you might have a project group that is meeting to create a certain object or something, and yet the behavior of the group seems to be guided from an outside observer by some other principle. And in fact, there's a whole science of group basic assumptions, which you approach by saying reflectively, it's like seeing this group claims to be designing a gadget, but it's actually behaving as if it were there to kill the leader, and things like that. So you get the perverse dynamics determining the outcomes, and that blocks the creative flow. So how do you handle that? A double loop learning is one factor where, for example, the second loop is not learning about, but learning how we're learning. It's being able to reflect on our assumptions. The empathetic appreciation particularly in a high performance environment, how people are feeling is that's unprofessional, isn't it? So you put that aside. And yet how people are feeling is going to be absolutely critical for creative activity. So the more the facilitator or the group together can actually feel what we're all going through, that's why in group meetings, for example, there is value in a check-in, which we haven't done in this meeting because we're not working that way. But you know, we've all come to this talk with a bunch of history and feelings and anticipations and what the hell's going to happen next and how long is he going to go on for and so on, and all of that would inhibit the free flow of ideas if it wasn't dealt with, which leads to self-awareness. And I think one of the key things in self-awareness is, particularly if you're playing the facilitator role, is the power of projection. That how we need to be sensitive, and we are sensitive, but that means we pick up all kinds of feelings going on in other people that may have actually nothing to do directly with or causatively with our situation. And so we end up, say, feeling depressed when it's not our depression, or we end up feeling agitated and anxious when it isn't our anxiety. And particularly in creative work, the nature of the creative process usually, or must in a sense, go through some kind of crisis, some kind of, oh, it's all falling apart, or it's never going to work, or we'll never make it. And holding the space so that the group can come through that and come out the other side is really important. But it's not possible for that to happen if we get swamped by the anxiety. And then I mentioned the mental repatterning. And here there are various techniques of what you know often have been called lateral thinking, but different ways of reframing our way of thinking, which are different from the methods that I mentioned earlier, like dilemma navigation or three horizons. They're more about how you kind of tickle your own mind or tickle the mind of the group to entertain different perspectives. And I don't know how many of you have played with metaphors, but metaphors can be a very powerful way of flipping the orientation to something. You know, something as crude as we seem to be thinking of it as an apple. What would happen if we thought of it as an orange? And you get segmentation coming in and so on. So those kinds of skills can be really helpful. And I think above all in creative work, something that's been in the research literature for some time, but is largely neglected because society is desperate for certainty and predictability. And if you're seen to tolerate ambiguity, it means you're not thinking straight and you're not decisive and you don't know what you're doing and you're untrustworthy, which of course may be true up to a point, but it's not true of everybody who's tolerating ambiguity. It may be that there's an open question here, and jumping to the conclusion immediately is going to kill the creativity. So one of the things I've found, particularly in the facilitator role, is, you know, when a group generally rubbish somebody's idea, I immediately latch onto it and give it credence, and try and have the contributor develop it, and then possibly, you know, shine some different angles on it, and see if it takes. And you know, sometimes that's impossible situation on day one. On day three, it's like, this is the way we're going to do it. And then the other thing, of course, that in our work we've been particularly keen on is visual patterning. That at the moment I'm majoring on verbs, you know, on verbal, on language, on speaking to you. I'm flashing up a few diagrams to perhaps help you pattern things in your mind. But if we were to actually work with the patterns intimately, which is the participative repatterning, then it's very much more powerful. And so one of the things that most of you in this group, I think, know that we're struggling with is, we got this to work beautifully with people in the same room and whiteboards, but now we've got this damn technology where we're not in the same room, or there's this kind of Zoom room thing that we're in now, which isn't entirely unreal, fortunately, but it's certainly not very concrete. And our interactions are limited, and there's a huge development needed in the technology to deal with that. So having got to there, then we have the basic skills to wrap around that, which are, in any given piece of work, what is the task? Given that it's the nature of the task, what's the appropriate method or methods? What's the context to be taken into account, including the situation and the technology? Then what's the actual process? What's the sequence? And there are various models of problem-solving processes out there, and some of them are better than others, but generally speaking, any kind of task with any complexity is usually a 6, 7, or 8 step process, which, if things are missed out, doesn't work very well. So so if you picture that, you know, the human being, as it were, has got this more rounded sense and has got a few techniques and tricks to do it better, the sort of skill bit, then the job becomes understanding enough of the aim or the goal to appreciate the shared creative gap facing the group. What are we really up against here, or what is our aspiration? What is our vision? A climate in which equitable involvement is encouraged and it's energized, and there's a kind of integrity to the process that gets us through it. And that's true even of very open dialogue processes that don't appear to have much structure, but actually they do have a very key set of processes. Configuring and reconfiguring technical contexts for visual dialogue. That's the whole thing about how do we, if we're going to do collaboration, what is the collaboration space in which we operate? And of course, there are various things emerging in fields like software, agile methods, and so on, which I have mixed feelings about in terms of their clarity as to what is technical what is additive and what is truly creative. And then there's a question of, if all we've got is a hammer, then everything's a nail. So if we don't actually increase our repertoire of ways we have of approaching things, then we're limited. So one of the things I've observed in our work over the last 4 or 5 years is that even if you pick up a method, and even if you pick up some way of, in your own way of creating and holding the space for a meeting, there's something about the inner state of being able to operate in group settings that honor the different aspects of the human being that lead to a greater probability of creativity. So that's the tip of the iceberg, just for revision. And then the idea, which is provisional, is that beginning at the end of January, a course of workshops rather than lectures like this. So we try and get them to be, given the technological limitations, get them as participative as possible, to actually get a better flavor of these things. And hopefully, I mean, those of you experienced in this field, which I guess is probably most of you here in this session, have all got development experience and learning in different facets of this. But there's something about maybe the way it all comes together, which might be for you a creative step if you signed up to it. And if you want to take a quick look at participative repatterning, chapter 6 of my book, I have to do one commercial at the end, is is worth a read. It's got some practical exercises in. So, phew, I think I managed to do that in about 45 minutes, which is quite a mouthful. But anyway, I'm now going to sit back and see what you fancy going into or sharing from your experience as well. I mean,